Almost half of the world's 1.9 billion children live in countries that will be severely affected by climate change. UNICEF says that the natural habitats of at least 33 nations are in danger of severe devastation. Most of these countries are in the global south. A report by the United Nations Children Agency, UNICEF, released the first Children's Climate Risk Index, which paints a gloomy picture for the future generations. Sub-Saharan countries will be most affected. Nigeria and South Africa are placed at the highest risk for heatwave exposure, whilst eastern and other southern African regions like Somalia and Madagascar do not have adequate water resources. For a little more on this report that was released on the 20th of August, we're now joined by Toby Fricker, who's the Chief of Communication and Partnerships for UNICEF South Africa. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much for having me on.
All right, so what motivated trying to track the effect that climate change might have on children across the world?
Yeah, I think this report essentially looks at two key areas. One is the exposure that children have to climate change, and that means looking at issues such as drought, such as extreme weather, such as flooding, and how that impacts on children. But it also looks at their existing vulnerability. And when I say that, we mean their vulnerability from, for example, poverty, or it could be, for example, issues such as malnutrition. So in South Africa, where we see 27% of children who are under 5 years of age, they are already more vulnerable to the impact of climate change on them. Their coping mechanisms are less than maybe some other children in South Africa, but also obviously in the region and across the world. So this is the first index that really sort of hones down on some of those key issues that are affecting children because of climate change, and trying to sort of analyze and trying to articulate those issues more clearly than maybe we've seen in the past.
So what are the headlines of this index, this report? What is it telling us?
Well, the index is essentially telling us that every child is at risk, and that really is the headline. Here in South Africa, what we're seeing is that we have issues such as water scarcity, we have water pollution, we have soil pollution. That are some of the key issues that affect children within South Africa specifically. But the reality is that 1 billion children are at risk of climate change and its related impacts on them. And that impact is broad ranging. It can affect their health, it can affect education, it can affect access to nutrition, for example, to food, etc. So I think the risks are there for everyone to see, and that's really what the index puts out there.
And what do we do with this information?
Well, I think the reality is that it's on the responsibility of all of us to respond. And I think the positive note is that climate change has been spoken about in a different way now. Over the last few years, we've seen the narrative change. And we've seen the narrative change primarily because of children and young people who have come out. They've spoken up about climate change. They've spoken up about the specific issues that affect them. But also they've spoken up because it's their futures. And that means it's on all of us. So that means it's on me, it's on UNICEF, it's on the government, it's on academia. It's all of us to come together to look at specific actions of how can we mitigate and adapt to climate change that is happening already. But that doesn't mean there's a lack of hope. And children and young people are always the ones who sort of hold on to that hope. And really, they're the ones who are driving this agenda that we're seeing now, which is why it's so important that they're involved in climate decisions today.
And the thing about climate and its effects is it doesn't happen overnight. So I guess a lot of what's in the report you have been seeing for some time now, with strong evidence that supports what you have found as maybe what a current index is saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the climate effect and the change is a slow process, let's face it. And I think what the report does, it also builds on the recent IPCC report, which highlighted the Code Red for humanity. But this report narrows down more onto the specific impact on children. And it's saying now is the time where we need to really step up And we're seeing children and young people engaging in climate issues across the world, in South Africa, but also further afield. And we're seeing them get engaged on the ground within community actions. But we also need to step up at multiple levels. And that means sort of at the policy level, but also on the ground.
So do you think that we now need to have, instead of just dealing with climate change, but to actually now have programs focused on children and climate change going forward?
Absolutely. I think it starts with education, and it starts from a young age. And I think we have, the Department of Basic Education have started to put climate change related issues into the curriculum, into life orientation classes. And that's where it starts. It's about the education from a young age, understanding the planet, but also understanding the direct environment around you. And how can you do even little steps? How can they help to the bigger picture? And I think that is absolutely critical, that we start at that young age. We build up that knowledge and that understanding about climate related issues. And then children and young people can really actually play their role through an informed role in supporting the response to adapting, to mitigating the impacts of climate change.
I suppose maybe another way of asking this question, South Africa, we've seen climate change issues. We almost had a day zero in Cape Town. Should government then say we have to focus as well on the children specifically in terms of what they may be going through in dealing with the effects of climate change?
Yes, I mean, I think that the report shows that the direct impact on children is there now. I mean, so if we look at, for example, water-related issues, that has a direct impact on the nutrition of children. Like I mentioned, the malnutrition, the stunting within South Africa, the nutritional value that children have in South Africa is already lacking. And I think when you have climate-related issues where you have water pollution, that can affect access to safe water. And when children don't have access to safe water, that affects nutrition. Whether or not they have access to food at the same time, water is absolutely key. So we see those direct impacts already. And I think the important thing is that we respond to those how and where we can, but also then we look sort of more long-term as how can we start to really reduce some of the greenhouse gases? How can we really start to tackle some of those other issues that are out there at the same time?
Sadly, one of the big issues that keeps coming up is that, Sub-Saharan Africa is not the biggest polluter, and yet possibly one of the biggest regions in terms of suffering the consequences. What can the international community, particularly the big polluters, do to help our continent and our continent's children?
Yeah, I think it's an issue now that it is not about sort of pointing fingers. The time has really come for solutions, and commitments are being made. Are they enough? That's another question, and that's what many people are working on at the United Nations and elsewhere. And we have the COP26 in Glasgow later this year, and the UN and young people will be coming together at that point to really bring home that message that you were just talking about, to bring home that message that more needs to be done now from the big emitters, wherever they are. And that is really an urgent message.
What would people like you be telling the gathering in Glasgow at the climate conference this year?
Well, we'll be saying, listen to children and young people. The planet it's their future. And in South Africa, young people have come together to draft an action plan, a youth action plan. UNICEF has worked with partners on a Reimagine Your Future declaration. And in all these partnerships, we always see children and young people who bring climate up. So it's obviously and clearly a primary issue for youth. And we're saying, and bring youth into those discussions, and let's hear from them, because they're the ones, as we've seen through this report, that are being affected directly already as well.
How many children do you think are at severe risk right now as we speak?
Well, I mean, the report shows that there are 1 billion children globally at risk of the impact of climate change and the direct sort of risks associated with that. And in South Africa, we've seen the Cape provinces where there's been a drought. We had the near day zero in Cape Town. But what we also saw when those issues happened, and with the Cape Town day zero, we saw people come together to respond. We saw people saying and looking at how can we save water, how can we help to avert day zero. And I think it's at those moments where people come together that we see that sort of solidarity, and we can see people actually actioning and coming together to further and solve some of these climate-related issues, or at least adapt to them in some way as best they can.
I'm looking at a map that is with this report, and it looks as if East Africa, just below the sort of Sahel region, and going west to DRC and possibly Congo. These are the most vulnerable parts of the continent in terms of this index.
They are, yes, they are, yes. Sub-Saharan Africa really does not come out well in the report, let's face it. And that's partly because of the climate change and what we're seeing across the region, the extreme weather, the droughts, the flooding, both localized but also more national. But at the same time, we also know that the coping mechanisms and the vulnerability of children in many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, are not there. So when those shocks happen, they really impact children on another level. And that's a real concern. And that's why the adaptation and the mitigation measures are so important.
Do you think that this issue of climate change risk for children is high enough up on the agenda for continental bodies like the AU? You know, you must be engaging with them. Are they saying this is an urgent agenda item?
I think we've seen a big shift over the last few years. We've seen a shift in the climate agenda. We've seen it climb up the ladder of importance for everyone, whether that's for the government in South Africa, whether that's for the African Union. And I think, you know, when children and young people bring these issues to decision makers, then it's time for us to listen. And we know, and we've seen the impact of climate change. We see it more and more on an everyday basis. And so I think it cannot be ignored anymore. And once again, you know, children and young people are the ones who keep bringing it to the fore. And we, as UNICEF and as the United Nations, we continue to work with African Union, we continue to work with the government here in South Africa and many others to support and provide a platform also for children and young people to present those issues.
Toby Fricker, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and speaking to this index and this report. I mean, 1 billion children at risk right now is an alarming figure, which means a lot of work needs to be done and done quite quickly. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so that's the UN Children's Agency, UNICEF's report, its index on climate change and the risk to children and what it might mean. And it paints a pretty grim picture. Let's hope that our leadership and people gathering in Glasgow for the next COP will work much faster, quicker and more urgently to deal with some of these issues.